Today's STAIR-tailored session is on decision-making as part of the DBI process. So once you have collected ongoing progress monitoring data for a particular student, you might start to think about what type of decision you want to make based on that data. A good rule of thumb or guideline that we're going to use is the trend line rule. And I'll talk more about the trend line rule and all of the specifics. We'll look through some examples, and then we'll actually see how this could be applied to some data that we've collected for an individual student. So the first step is to compare the student's current rate of growth against the goal line. You'll have individual data points that you've collected, but we're going to actually map a trend line or insert a trend line into that data so that we sort of even out those data points. Sometimes when we collect progress monitoring data, there are highs or lows in the data, some variability. So we sort of want to even out or stabilize that data, and a trend line is a great way to do that. We'll talk to you more about how to insert a trend line on your graph, but for today, let's think more about that trend line and how it compares to the goal line that you set for each individual student. You want to ask yourself, is the trend line above or steeper than the goal line? Is the trend line the same as or even with the goal line? Or is the trend line below or flatter than the goal line? These will be your basic 3 questions that you ask, and this will guide you into next steps according to decision making for next steps in intervention for your student. So let's look at an example. This is sort of a graphic of our next steps as we consider these 3 different options in examining the trend line. The first option, as I suggested before, is that the trend line is actually steeper than the goal line. This is actually a great case. This means your student is actually exceeding the performance goal that you set. And in this case, it may be time to actually increase the goal. Now, I'll say that one aside to this is that we don't want to raise the goal too quickly before we feel like the student is really stable and on track. And so it may be that we collect 2 cycles of data where the trend line is steeper than the goal. And then at that point, after 2 cycles, we feel really confident that the student is on track. We actually increase the goal at that time. A second decision might be that the trend line is actually almost even with the goal line. In this case, we stay as is, stay the course, continue with the current regimen of instruction, and then we're going to reapply the trend line after an additional 4 to 6 data points. Finally, it might be that the trend line is actually flatter or less steep than the goal line, and in this case, we're going to change instruction. In any case, you're looking at data on a regular basis. We're going to suggest that as often as every 4 data points, you're looking at the student's graphed data and you're applying the trend line rule and making one of these decisions. It could be that you're working with your grade level peers to look at graph data for students who are part of the project, and together you're thinking through and applying these decision-making rules. So here are some quick examples. Here is a case where the trend line, you can see in green, is even with the goal line in blue. And so in this case, trend line even with the goal, the decision would be, that's right, stay the course. You're going to continue instruction as is. It could be, in this case, that trend line is actually above the goal line. So in this case, you can see already I've given you a nice little hint here. Decision, raise the goal. And as I mentioned before, we want to make sure that that data has really stabilized. Here, we actually had 8 data points prior to raising that goal line. In this case, trend below the goal line. Again, little hint here, you can see the decision would be change instruction. And so in this case, the student right now is not on track to meet long-range goal. We need to change instruction if we hope for that student to get back on track. Here's another example with all of the pieces put together. So you can see over here, we've established some baseline data. We've collected some baseline data. And we've talked before about this baseline data, and we use this as a starting point for our goal line. Right here, you can see all the way up here is our goal line. Our goal line ends about right here. But we've used our initial starting point, and then we've established that goal line. Along the way, the teacher for this particular student has been collecting data first as part of intervention 1, and then as part of intervention phase 2. Now let's see how we implement that decision making, or how the teacher implemented decision making as part of that examining graph data. So the first step, as I mentioned before, was to set that annual goal for the individual student. And we used the median baseline data, and then we used the benchmarks for the particular progress monitoring system in mathematics to establish a long-range goal. Next, the teacher would monitor individual progress. In this case, the teacher was collecting 4 data points before making a decision. And so this data collection might have occurred as part of the algebra progress monitoring system. Then this graph data was, the scores from that computerized program were entered as graph data. The next step is to actually map a trend line into that data. You can see that there's sort of some highs and lows in this data as we move along. It's important to map a trend line, insert a trend line into the data to get a better sense of what this data is telling us. So you can see at this point, the trend line is angling down. Now the step comes to evaluate and modify instruction on the basis of rate of progress toward the goal. I think we can clearly see that if you look at this trend line, the trend line moving away from the goal, it's time to make a change in instruction. And in fact, that's what the teacher did, inserting an instructional change line and then continuing to monitor progress. You can see another trend line here that the teacher actually inserted. It starts sort of right here and moves up. In this case, the trend line compared to the goal line is suggesting that intervention 2 is actually being fairly successful for that student. Again, we have those 4 data points in this second intervention. Things at this point, the decision would be to stay the course. Things are looking good, and the teacher would continue monitoring, looking at the data, each 4 data points, and then making a decision based on that data. Okay, I'm going to come right back to you. Okay, I got to just erase all this stuff real quick. So that's more on tailored STAIR PD on using decision-making rules, and we appreciate your involvement in the STAIR project.